Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We hope you are having an awesome Tuesday. We are excited to be hosting our fourth session this evening of our Teacher Talk series. We're going to give folks just a couple of minutes to hop on, and then we will get started. We're really excited, have a great group of panelists, and we'll get started here in just a second. Okay, well, again, as I mentioned, welcome to our fourth Teach Indie Teacher Talk. We're very excited. This year, this season, we've been focused on really analyzing data, but not just analyzing data for data's sake, but really getting in and having great conversations with teachers who are in classrooms every single day, using the data to really impact student achievement. Today's session, we're going to be focusing on special education data and how it relates to the iLearn assessment. If you remember back in the fall, we actually did a session on iLearn. So some of this data might look a little familiar to you. So let's go ahead and get ourselves started. If this is your first time joining us, I'd love to just give you a little bit of an overview about Teach Indie. So my name is Sarah Marshall. I'm the executive director of Teach Indie. Teach Indie is an education nonprofit here in the city with a mission to recruit, develop, reward, and retain excellent educators for the city of Indianapolis. We are almost at the 1-year mark of being our own education nonprofit and very excited for this conversation and what it looks like in the future as well. I'm joined tonight by a great group of panelists, and one of them is Dr. Sherry Anderson, who I'm going to toss it over to introduce her great organization as well.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here sharing out with you this evening. My name is Sherry Anderson, and I have been in the field of special education for approximately 30 years in multiple roles, one as a public school teacher, the other as a university professor, 16 years full-time in that role. Also, I served as a special education director, and currently I'm founder and president of SPEDAX, which is a nonprofit special education organization with a mission to provide schools with affordable access to special education services, whether that be related services, mentoring of new teachers, or up-and-coming directors. We offer professional development across our membership schools. Really a pleasure to be here. I'm also joined with two nice, wonderful panelists, and I will give them a chance to introduce themselves. Elise, you go first.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Elise Payne, and I am really excited to be here today. I've worked in the field of special education now for about 15 years. I've been able to serve in a variety of different capacities, starting as a special education teacher. I've been able to serve as an instructional coach, a school-based administrator, and a director for a district as well. I'm super excited for my new role as a mom. So here recently I've been staying home with my daughter, but consulting on the side. And so I've been blessed to partner with Sherry and work with her through her company SPEDAX to provide supports to different school districts, professional development, and other types of services. And also work with her through her program SPEDRAL, which I think you guys will learn a little bit more about later. So thank you for having me today.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa McIntyre. I am currently the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at Vanguard Collegiate of Indianapolis. We are located currently in the Hawthorne Community Center, but we're in the Hawville neighborhood. I am also, in my role as well, a social studies teacher. I teach 6th grade. And I've done that for the past 5 years. I love teaching middle school kids. I know some people are like, middle school, but it's definitely something that I have a passion for. And then I also am a student right now in Dr. Anderson's federal program, which has been amazing. I feel like I've learned more within these last few months than I feel like I had previously, getting even my bachelor's and master's. It's just so much material that I can actually like apply now. And it's just so relevant to sort of where our school is right now. And as we know, we sort of have a shortage of special education teachers. There's a shortage of teachers, but special education teachers especially. So this has been an amazing sort of experience with that as well. Yeah, that's me.
Well, as I shared at the beginning, we have a powerhouse panel, right? As you heard their introductions, every single session, we've had just incredible panelists. And so I'm thrilled to be joined by all of these incredible leaders. So let's talk a little bit about how we're going to be spending our time this evening. We always like to ground ourselves in our agenda. We're going to start by talking about some data and first learning a little bit about what is iLearn, if you're not as familiar with that statewide assessment. We'll look at some statewide data, Marion County data, and then most importantly, we're going to have a conversation with the educators that are on the panel with us today. I would be remiss if I didn't share that we will have an opportunity for Q&A. So if you have any questions for the panelists, we will hold time at the end of the session. So feel free to drop those in the chat on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll be able to pop those up towards the end of our conversation. And then we will wrap up and you'll get to learn a little bit more about SpedRAL, just as Elise previewed, and about an upcoming Teach Indie event. So with that, we will transition to our data. So if you've been with us before, we have really tried to make sure that we frame that, when we're analyzing data, we know that a single assessment isn't going to tell us everything about a student or about a group of students. It is simply a starting place for us to see what is working, maybe what is not working as well, and allows us to really analyze our own practice to make changes as needed. We know that our educators are working extremely hard. And so what we don't want to say is this data means anyone's not doing their very best, or that teachers aren't working, to meet the needs of students. In fact, I actually think teachers are working way harder. And I hope this data implores us to figure out what's working where and how can we do more of what's working. So that's really what we're trying to get at today. So let's talk a little bit about the iLearn assessment. For those that are teaching, you may know this is coming up very soon in mid-April. So the iLearn assessment is taken each spring by all public school students in grades 3 through 8. So again, Alyssa's middle schoolers are taking that. The third graders, this is their first time taking it. And that usually ends up with the data being returned back to families and schools in May and June. And we get statewide rolled up data around July and August. This is why we use this data in September in our first session. Each grade level is assessed on ELA and math. ELA stands for English Language Arts, and then mathematics. And then at various grades, we also assess social studies and science, but that is not across all grades. So that's why we're really going to dig into just ELA and math, because we can compare across multiple subgroups. The test is really grounded in the state standards. So we do everything that we can to make sure that we're meeting the expectations of the standard, and this assessment is assessing how we're doing towards meeting that benchmark. When we receive iLearn scores back, there are 4 different kind of levels of proficiency. There are folks that are above proficiency, which receive a score of pass, folks that are at proficiency. Approaching proficiency means they didn't meet the mark, but they're very close to doing so. And then below proficiency, you'll notice 2 of these scores are passing, 2 are not. But that approaching, I think, is also beneficial for us to know just how far off a student is to meeting that proficiency bar. A student officially passes iLearn if they reach at proficiency or above in math and ELA. And when you look at school-specific data, school data is a wrap-up or the addition of both the ELA and the math portions. So again, want to restate that while the school gets them separated, the final score for the school is the combined score of folks that are passing both sections of the assessment. So tonight we're going to be focusing our attention on kind of a special population of students, and these are students that are receiving special education services. These superhero students, I will just name that, also take the iLearn assessment. Some of them may receive some accommodations or some accommodations more than modifications for iLearn, but they are assessed with their general education peers. And then we look at statewide proficiency, looking at how special education students performed with their general education peers. It's important for us to note here on this slide, and before we dig into the data, that there are significantly larger population, there we go, of general education students than special education students. So we aren't comparing 100% apples to apples in terms of the numbers. There's a much larger population in general education. The last thing I will say here is we don't have data on subgroups within special education, meaning we aren't presenting data of different racial subgroups or socioeconomic subgroups and students that are receiving special education services. So, but we acknowledge that there are certainly students that are identified as multiple subgroups that are differently, we'll say, impacted by the data that we're going to be taking a look at. So with that as our frame, we want to start by taking a look at the statewide testing results. And we're looking back to the school year 2019. And again, you'll see us comparing our special education population and then our general education population. I should note that as you see this table that's coming up, that 2020 was the COVID year. And so we did not actually assess students in 2020, but we do have the last couple of years coming out of the pandemic, as well as the year directly preceding the pandemic. And we can see how our special education students did as compared to their general education student peers. Things to name. If you were with us for our first session, we saw the pandemic impacted all students pretty significantly. And I think maybe the glimmer or the positive is that we did have a slight growth from 21 to 22, while not significant. We are seeing that we're moving in a better direction or the right direction. And so we do want to call that out. And then I will also frame that this slide is that combination of both math and ELA and how our students did. I'm going to pause here because I've talked a lot and wondering if any of our panelists just have any reactions at first to this first statewide data slide.
Of course, I'm going to jump in with the special education column because it's very disheartening to me. First of all, 10% in 2019, or we can round it up to 11 if you will. That is still not good data. And yes, totally understand 2020. No one needed to collect data because we did school in such a different way across the state. But as students, we had a year to kind of figure it out how to do school differently. And hasn't changed much for our kiddos, our students with disabilities. Although I do see, there is a jump from 21 to 22, at least in some single digits, if I'm reading these numbers correctly, maybe not just for the gap, but for the gen ed students. And that is not what we're seeing in the special ed column. We're just seeing just 0.6% increase. That tells us that we're not doing something right, but we already weren't doing something right. I'm gonna stop there. and let someone else talk.
To build off of that, I think the thing that stands out to me is we had a challenge before COVID. And so COVID just kind of widened that challenge for us and shifted our frame in terms of we have to tackle it a different type of way. One thing that is interesting with the data is the gap actually decreased after COVID, which is interesting. And I think that kind of tells somewhat of a story. And it's hard to say with data this wide exactly what that story is, but that stood out in looking at the slide.
Yeah, I think Dr. Anderson and Elise make great points. The fact that the data sort of showed us that the pass rates were low prior to COVID. Something that I say a lot since COVID is that I feel like COVID was the perfect, or that whole sort of year through the pandemic was a perfect time for us to like look at the data prior and look at school differently. And I don't know, I think in some spaces we've had, and I know like there's a lot of changes that have come out of COVID. However, it was a perfect time for us to transform how we look at school. And if we don't, and I feel like we're still in that time frame where we can, but if we don't look at school differently, I feel like, as you mentioned earlier, we will see some increase because naturally, of course, we should. Now most of our students are in the building. And so, but however, I don't know if we'll see sort of that pass rate go up as much as we would like if we continue looking at school like we did in 2019 or 2020 and prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much for those reflections. And again, I'm excited for then the questions at the end where we start to ask you also, what should we do? What should we be doing and thinking differently? So we also have one additional slide here at the state level where we thought it might be helpful to just disaggregate ELA and math separately. As a reminder, we presented them previously, and in the next couple slides, they are together, but we brought this slide forward to show you that there was actually a difference in the data in math and ELA. Fascinating to me that general education actually scored a little bit higher in ELA, but then scored lower in math, where our special education students scored a little bit lower in ELA, but had a little bit of a better performance in mathematics. So something that, again, I think this is where it's important to analyze subgroup data, to take a look at both to see what can we build on from the math side to keep it going in the right direction, and what do we need to change on the ELA side.
Yeah, so can I just tap in here, Sarah, and tell you that the way that those percentages are working, ELA and math for special education, looks kind of like the trend that we see across the board in our field. Typically, our kiddos struggle with reading. And as you know, reading encompasses a lot in education and in life. So you need reading to do math, you need reading to do social studies, science. So a majority of our kiddos, particularly those with specific learning disabilities who make up 50% of the special education population, will have reading goals or some type of reading difficulty expressed on their IEP. Math tends to be a strong suit for students with disabilities, even though it may not be, the best. Usually they score better in math. I'd like to defer to Ms. Payne and Ms. McIntyre if they're finding that in their data as well.
Yes, I can echo that. Just in terms of what, at least at what you see on IEPs, it's typically the disability is typically in reading initially, and that's where you typically see the gap.
Yeah, I can say definitely this is true for our older grades, as where reading is super important for math as you get older, where you have more complex word problems, where you have to analyze those and things like that. I think that we've definitely seen, of course, the struggle in reading more so than math.
appreciate those thoughts and that call out around learning goals and IEPs that again are incredibly important for our students. I recognize that some people that are joining us maybe have no idea they're thinking about becoming a teacher, and can somebody just give us an overview of what is an IEP at a like really high level so that we make sure that we bring everybody into this space with us?
Sure. So an IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. A lot of you will hear Individualized Education Plan. That gets on my nerves because that's not how it's presented in the law, and it's a program. And every student with a disability who has been found eligible for one of the 13 disability categories that exist in our field will have an IEP, and basically it is a roadmap for how we are to instruct and provide support for students with disabilities so that the education playing field is leveled.
Thank you for that. I really love the concept of roadmap. I also love that your IEP, as you described it, involves not just the teachers and the educators, but also the families and the parents. I am really fortunate. I'm married to a special education teacher, so I know a little bit about this, and I appreciate how intentional folks are on bringing families into the process to make sure that students are getting what they need and that families are involved in that process as well. So we're going to zoom in just a little bit more. We've talked a little bit about statewide data, but as you know, Teach Indy does a lot of work in Marion County specifically. So I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Anderson as we kind of zoom in on Marion County specifically.
So thank you, Ms. Marshall. I appreciate the conversation has been rich thus far, and hopefully it will continue. For those of you who are with us, just when we talk about Marion County data, we're talking about 11 school districts and several public charter schools. And so two things. I do want all of you to know that charter schools are public schools. And we have grouped all of those independent charter schools into one data group. So when you see the next slide, I just want you to be aware of that. So when we jump to the next slide, we're going to see Marion County data across special education and their school districts and compared to their general education peers. If you look at the data, these data on here, I have a question for the panel. As you look at this, what's jumping out at you?
Something that's jumping out to me is how big the gap is between certain places and districts like Speedway and Perry and Franklin, right? I know there are, of course, a lot of like outside factors when it comes to like socioeconomic status, race, all of those different key things play a part in this data, but it also makes me question, what are they doing? What are they doing that would be so much different than what Pike is doing, what charter schools are doing, right? I don't want to go into too much on my theory on why, besides the outside factors that we, of course, need to take place. But if we're focusing on school and when it comes to curriculum and standards, I think there's definitely like a clear difference on what's sort of happening there and in districts where you see sort of those lower passing rates.
Building off that, I do think it's hard not to see disaggregated data just because it's so relevant in the conversation. I do think where you see less of a gap, my wondering is around what other challenges and barriers are they having to work through or not having to work through that perhaps the other schools or districts are having to, and how does that perhaps impact or deplete some of the resources in terms of supporting all students. It also makes me wonder what's the starting point, and even thinking initially in preschool or kindergarten when kids walk through the doors for the very first time, is the starting point somewhat similar or is it drastically different? And if it is drastically different, the approach, like you were saying earlier, Ms. McIntyre, to supporting kids and schooling kids may have to look different. And so the question may not be what are they doing, because our approach might have to look different for school districts that are serving different types of kids. We might not be able to replicate the same type of supports or the same model. So the gap really stands out, but I do think it's worth better understanding what's happening in those districts where the gap is lessened.
Yeah, and I think we also need to consider parceling, even though, as Ms. Marshall had presented on an earlier slide, we need to look at socioeconomic status. We need to look at race. We need to look at gender to really see how this data can inform our practice.
And Dr. Anderson, I would add, just with the SPED brain, it also makes you wonder, as any type of educator, but specifically special education, like what is happening specifically in special education within the district? How are services and support structured? What does the staffing model look like? Because that's so critical, just influencing the outcomes for all students, but specifically students who are identified within your SPED population.
Yep, very good point. Very good point.
Can I jump in as the non-SPED educator? One thing that stands out to me is just how different students are performing across our different townships. And it's not to point the finger, as we called out earlier, but it is to say how critical it is as the role of parents and teachers to make sure that we're looking at this data, and that we don't just rest on our laurels that just because where we live means that means we have great data, right? And so taking that time to analyze the data and just double checking to make sure that we're asking these questions, I think is so critical. And the last thing is, like, I always think through that the best practices for serving students in special education really are best practices for all students. And so how do we make sure that where things are going right, that we're figuring out like what's happening there? Let's go figure out that question. Like Alyssa was saying about Speedway, like, let's go figure it out. Let's go watch them in action, and figure out what we can use as well.
Right.
I did have something. So keeping in, like, as was stated by Mrs. Payne, for sure, it looks different. I feel like the approach for different students, it does, right? I am in no way in a colorblind type of person where, everything works for every person. And I mean that whether it's race, whether we're talking about disability, anything. However, my question is more so, and I should have framed it differently, not necessarily how can we look at like a Speedway and a Perry to replicate, but how are they preparing their students differently than, for example, in charter schools, how then we're preparing our students. And it could look different on how we prepare our students. However, ultimately, they're all taking the same test. And so how can we keep all of these different things that we know our students go through in mind and provide different supports for them to ensure that they are able to sort of be successful and be prepared to take this standardized test. And again, it looks much different. I feel like also it, like she said, students coming in, when it comes to like kindergarten and lower grades, how prepared are they when they come into school? How much support do they have at home? And keeping that in mind once they get to secondary, where I'm at in middle school, if we have kids that are multiple grade levels behind, what are we doing to make sure that we're not sort of getting in this remediation funk where, okay, I have to remediate. And we talk a lot at our school, and I talk with our teachers here about like remediation versus acceleration. We know that there are some gaps, but we don't want to go back to teaching. Let's say a student is in the 5th grade. We don't want to spend a full year teaching 3rd grade, 4th grade standards, because that's not going to prepare them to take the 5th grade iLearn test. So how can we make sure that we're incorporating those things, and also keeping in mind, like, okay, this is where my student may stand, but making sure that we're also giving them access to those high quality materials that will allow them to be prepared for the iLearn. And it takes being creative. And I know we talk about that word differentiation a lot. It takes a lot of that, but also keeping in high expectations for our students as well.
That's good. That's good. Now, if we can move to our next slide, we can talk a little bit deeper beyond the data. So,
Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited for this. You all are giving me so much energy. So I'm going to back out and just facilitate questions here. But let's start with this first one. And when we do our questions, actually, let me pause. If you are watching live, I should also say we are going to hold time for questions at the end. So if you've got a great question, please feel free to drop that in the chat again. And we will make sure that we get to your question as we get going. I know we've got some great expertise on the call, so feel free to ask them the question that you've got. So let's start with this first question that we hope really spurs teachers that are watching to think about this. So how do you or your school or Dr. Anderson, the schools that you're working with, how do you use this data specifically as it pertains to special education students, and it doesn't just live in a really pretty table like we just showed? So I'll start with Dr. Anderson, and then we'll go from there.
So let me go back to the not so distant future or my past and tell you that as a special education director, it was very important for me to look at data across all of our kiddos by disability category, also by minutes being served for them, also by providing opportunities that weren't there previously. So I'll give you an example. After looking at some state assessment data for one of our high schools, which could easily be filtered down to middle and elementary schools, I realized that our students with disabilities were really struggling in the reading area and the writing area. And so what I did was offer support during breaks, like their Christmas break, just before their Christmas break or just before their spring break, that would allow us, being the special ed team, an opportunity to really hone in on those skills that they already had deficits in, but also teach them how to approach tests like a state assessment, and how to practice not teaching to the test, but how to practice life skills that will assist you in taking various tests like college entrance exams and state assessment tests, from moving from one grade to the next. I'll stop there because we have other directors and former directors and teachers on the line.
To build off of that, I think one thing that I was passionate about, specifically as like a district-wide director, anytime you look at any data for any student across your school or across your district, how do you ensure that's disaggregated to include your special education population? Because I tried not to position it to where I'm exclusively looking at special education data, but what does it look like in comparison to the performance of our overall population of students, and really trying to capture what the gap was and why with that specific data set. And so for me, it's a process of nagging to constantly ensure that you have that data, because there has to be an intentionality around it, and then supporting teachers, leaders in terms of understanding, interpreting, and analyzing that data and asking the right types of questions. And I think also from the special education lens, ideally what should be included within a student's IEPs are goals that address their deficits, and then constantly monitoring whether or not that they're addressing that gap that exists. So I think prior to really analyzing that data, we have to ensure that we're supporting our special education teachers in writing accurate and strong goals that really address the deficits that the students have. And then we have to be diligent in terms of monitoring that progress and whether or not that deficit is being addressed or not. And in a timely manner, so we don't, like Ms. McIntyre said earlier, we don't have a lot of time to address the gap. So how do we do it quickly?
Yeah, that's a really helpful frame. I think that like concept of quickly, right? Like so that the data doesn't sit and we can't act on it. I think I'm going to move us to the second question. And in particular, Alyssa, I would love your thoughts on this as a practicing classroom teacher and one that's coaching and like working with teachers. We know that iLearn is summative, right? It's like at the end. And I'm sure that there are other data sets that are super important for working with students, especially students with in special education. So can you talk to us a little bit about like, what are you looking for beyond just this data set, and how do these like work together in an effective way?
Yeah, absolutely. So we look at a few things. So we also use sort of as our growth assessment is NWEA, especially when it comes to when we're in those conferences or case conferences with students aligning their goals to sort of the data that we get from NWEA. So we have, if you log on to teachers and who are familiar with NWEA, if you go into the actual like reports, it gives you like specifically where students are struggling when it comes to math and reading, and as well as science and writing as well. And so looking at that sort of where are students struggling with that data, and then making sure that that's aligned to their goals when it comes to their IEP has really like helped sort of some of our students, and I feel like our teachers, making sure that they're aligned with the correct goals. Something else that we use is of course our curriculum-based assessments as well. And so there is a feature in our curriculum where we're able to sort of differentiate between students and where their levels are when it comes to ELA, and for math as well. The curriculum does it for that as well. And so then we're able to sort of look at it based on standard, where students align, and then sort of use that data in order to make changes and sort of inform instruction. We also use it, we're a smaller school, so we don't have like a huge population of students, but it also gives, when we're in our sort of PDs and any type of like grade level or content team meetings, most teachers in our building, they see the same students. Like if you're teaching 6th grade, you probably teach 7th grade in maybe 8th grade, depending on what it is. And so therefore they're better able to sort of look at that data and then figure out what's the best way to attack whatever that is, or whatever that issue is the student is having based on that data. And our team has done a wonderful job with collaborating this year, and sort of, okay, I'm making sure if I know that I'm seeing this gap when it comes to writing in the classroom, not only are we practicing that in our social studies classroom and our ELA classroom, but we're also going to practice that in the math classroom as well, to make sure that sort of, and it's easier. I know when you're in a bigger school, it's harder, but we're a smaller school, so we're able to do that. And then just the last piece on sort of a big data point for us is we use Achieve 3000, and it actually aligns. It's of course gives, it's based on students' Lexhouse score, but it also aligns to iLearn as well, and sort of tells us where a student sort of stands when it comes to passing the ELA portion of the iLearn. So it says, okay, this student is on track, this student is not, this student is there. So then we're able to use that data as well.
That's really helpful. I'm Elise or Dr. Anderson. Any other data sets that we didn't hear from Ms. McIntyre that you think we might want to discuss here? I do know that one of the things that was really great about the last conversation we had with like K2 was they spent a little bit of time on just like informal assessments, like asking kids to sound out words on their way to lunch, and us like making sure that we understand like that is also data, right? Instead of just these big assessments. So I just want to hold space for anything else that you would say, like specifically for special education students, that you might see teachers looking for.
Yeah. So one thing that I'm always passionate about, and making a connection with our general education teachers, because students with disabilities are just not special education teachers' students. They're everybody's student. And general education teachers have a seat at the table when it comes to preparing the individualized education program. They are their expertise in their various areas. So one thing that we do is we provide the general education teachers with a copy of the IEP at a glance, which is to be held in a special place, confidential. It's not supposed to be shared with everyone. And we also have something that's required by law called progress monitoring on those goals that each student with the disability has. And one thing that we do is we share with the gen ed teachers, when I was a director, the progress that we're seeing on each of the kids that they have in their classrooms with disabilities, so that they will know how the data looks for each kid and how they can help them and help us help them, because it's a team effort.
I love that you actually segued us right into that next question, which is awesome, right? Like, how do we make sure, and you said it great, like special education students are also the general education students. And Alyssa, you brought this up too, right? Like all the way from, you might teach them 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So is there anything else specific you would call out on how to make sure that general education students and special education, or excuse me, general education teachers and special education teachers are working together to make sure that they're moving the data? Elise or Alyssa, anything to add there?
You want to go?
Go ahead. I'll add on after you.
Okay. I would say to make sure that teachers are, one, familiar with the goals of students. That's at the forefront, like knowing what the goal is that student has, and then making sure that you're keeping that in mind in what you do in your classroom. And then also, I feel like making sure that you know the progress of that student on that goal. And so for the special education teacher, it's sort of easier to track that because you see the different data points and you're able to sort of look at sort of where the student stands on the goal. But it's also important for the general education teacher to know as well, right? And so to make sure that they're also tracking that and they're able to meet in the case conference and come in and say, my student is here with this goal. I think that we no longer need this goal, right? Because the goal is for our students to be able to master these goals and no longer have this goal, not to have this goal for a whole year or multiple years. And so if the teachers are on board with that as well, then they'll be better able to say, okay, my student actually is like mastering this goal, and I have evidence of this, but them also making sure that they're tracking it and not just the special education teacher tracking that sort of progress on each goal.
Building off of that too, I think there just has to be intentionality around creating the space for collaboration. And Sarah, you mentioned earlier, like teachers are working super, super hard, and it's really difficult to receive a stack of IEP at a glances. And it gets added to your to-do list to read through it. But you've got to create the space to do it, and then you've got to internalize that information, which can be a challenge, especially if perhaps you're new to teaching or you're just less familiar when it comes to IEPs. So I think trying to create the space for your special education teachers and your gen ed teachers to come together to have conversations. Let's talk about what this document says. I also think actually coming to case conferences just helps to build everyone's collective understanding, as to how the process goes, but B, why this information, why these particular supports are in this document for this particular student. So all of these decisions are made in a meeting that all of those students' teachers are invited to. And I know the schedule doesn't allow for everyone from the team to come, but the law does require that at least one general education teacher be present at those case conferences. And I think a lot of learning, A, about the process, but B, how to support that student can take place there. And a lot of great questions can be asked as well. And then to build off of what Ms. McIntyre said, I think understanding that it's a collective effort in terms of knowing what the goals are, collecting that information, and doing it in a way where it doesn't feel like an added thing to do and an additional responsibility. If goals are written well, you're able to collect that data through what's likely already happening in the classroom and through existing structures. So just really having that intentionality to create the space for collaboration. And then once you've created the space, you've got to hold people accountable to actually do it. And that does require support and from your leadership team. It requires self-accountability in terms of engaging in those type of conversations.
Time and accountability, right? Super critical for us to move the needle forward. I think everything you all shared resonated really strongly. I know I actually think Alyssa answered this last question earlier about the importance of really thinking through, but I want to just frame this last question for any additional thoughts of, how are we looking at special education data while also taking a look at race or other subgroup data so that we can really move the needle for achievement to close that achievement gap. Any other like last minute responses here?
I think the first thing is that we have to realize that there exists a difference among children of different races when it comes to special education. If you deny that, we're not moving any needle anywhere. The other piece is that we need to become more culturally sensitive, and I'm talking about the whole teaching profession as a whole, when it comes to educating all God's children. We are all different, and it shouldn't be that one group in terms of race and culture are not advancing compared to other groups. Everyone should be advancing, and of course you're going to have your nuances and diversity in between that, but there should not be stark differences across races and cultures.
And to build off that, you won't know if there's a difference if you don't break the data down. And so I think anytime you look at data, you've got to disaggregate it. And I know in classrooms, you might do weekly or daily exit tickets. And so it might not be feasible to break it down that frequently. But as a school, as a district, what is your calendar in terms of looking at data, and how do you hold yourself accountable every single time to break that down? And you can break it and cut it in so many different ways. But if you're not looking at it, you're not going to see the issue. And so how do we collectively hold ourselves accountable to do that on an ongoing basis as we're looking at different pieces of data set?
Thanks for that. Right. Even today in presenting the data, we didn't cut the data also by any other subgroup. Right. And so Elise, your point is well taken. If we don't take the time to cut the data, we won't know. And Dr. Anderson, then your point won't happen, right? We can't close the gap if we're not taking a look at it. So thank you all for your actions on this slide. Again, I'm going to plug one more time. If you've got a question in the chat, please feel free to drop that there. And we're excited to take your questions for this panel. Our last kind of set of questions is more about like the future, right? And so if we've got educators that are on here that are trying to figure out, okay, so like, what do I do tomorrow? How do I do a better job of supporting my students that are in special education? And also, how do we involve parents, right? How do we involve the community? So let's take this first question, open to anyone. Really, how does this data impact your daily work with students, but also like parents and the community? I think, Alyssa, you're in a unique spot because you're in a community center, right? So you have Hawthorne around you. So I'm just curious how we're thinking about this data impacting us.
So I think that daily, it impacts us in a way of sort of what I said earlier. How are we preparing our students? I'm huge on preparation and making sure that our students, our special education students, and our student population in general has access to teachers and materials each day that will prepare them. And so something that I would sort of say, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but something that I would say for like teachers is look at your curriculum, look at the materials that you're giving your students, and are you giving them access to high quality materials, and especially our special education population, right? And so I understand, of course, you would have to differentiate based on their needs. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not still making sure that everything that we do is aligned to the standard. And so if we're doing that and making sure we have that expectation of, okay, I'm making sure that this is aligned to my overall target and the assessment that I give is aligned to this overall standard, but then I'm giving these whatever supports needed in order to get that specific student there, then I feel like we could see, better results in the data. And then there's also sort of this, I always talk about the sort of language that is used on those standardized tests, and things like analyze, evaluate, identify. Those seem like small things, like, oh, those are small things. I'm not making sure my students know that, or I'm not teaching that. And if you do not, then when our special education students see that on a test, but you've watered down or didn't teach them that word, when they see that on a test, they may very well know how to do that, except they don't know what that means. So they're like, identify. So if you're not making sure that we're equipping them with that like vocabulary that is used and on those tests, then our students, I know they've said this to me before, they're using words, I don't know what these words are. I'm like, you did that yesterday. What do you mean? And so they're like, they're not familiar. If they're not familiar with that, those smaller things on the test, I feel like that definitely can impact. So teachers, I say all that to say, make sure that you're preparing, students.
And if I could just talk to the how do you get families to understand student data, I can tell you as a director that at least twice a year, we would have a sit down meal paid for by the special education budget with families to actually go through, okay, here's what the data look like for our school. Here's where our kids with disabilities are falling. You've gotten copies. Here's your opportunity now to ask questions, not as a group, but we have little stations provided where they could sit and talk with me, or they could talk with their child's teacher of record, so that they could truly understand what is being sent home. And I can't tell you how just a little knowledge empowers parents to make better decisions for their children.
And building off that, I think also keeping in mind when we have these case conferences with families, it's a critical time for them to ensure that they understand what is all included in that document. And so using terms and using language that they're able to understand, reading their body language if it appears as though they don't understand, making sure they feel a part of that process. And I think also for specifically our general education teachers, not to add to the to-do list, but ask yourself, do I know who my students are in my classroom who have IEPs? Do I know why they have IEPs? Do I know what their goals and supports look like? And if you don't, make it a priority to find out and check. And then also just ensuring that we look at the data we looked at here today. It's not, I think we can all agree, it's not where we want it to be. And so leveraging that as your fire and your fuel every single day, because the reality is, to the question, this impacts overall outcomes for kids, and not just their performance in school, but 10 years from now, 15, 20 years from now, when they're no longer in the K-12 setting. And I think we're all familiar with what the data says. If you're struggling in reading or math, or you leave school reading at a second and third grade level. So how can you use this to motivate you every single day, although they're rough and hard days, to show up the next day re-energized and really intentional about supporting those students in our care?
I could really chat with you all day. But I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear a little bit more about the SPED RAL program. So I'm going to fast forward us. And I think, Elise, you helped us really well here by saying we all saw the data today. We all know it's not exactly where we want it to be, but we also know it can get better as soon as tomorrow. So I'm going to kind of pull a lot of these questions all together into one final question. If you could speak to teachers specifically, all three of you, what is one tool or resource or support that you would share with educators that would help them get better with serving students with disabilities as early as tomorrow?
I'll go first. I guess it's not really a tool, but it's a mindset, and that is students with disabilities belong to everyone. And you need to build a relationship with your, if you're a gen ed teacher, you need to build a relationship with your special education teacher. If you're a special education teacher, you need to build a relationship with your general education teacher in order to make sure that we assist in changing the overall data for kids with disabilities, which is that they drop out of school, it's hard to get a job, and they don't go to college on the regular like everyone else.
And building off of that, I think reemphasizing, I think it was said earlier, best practice aligned to supporting our students who are identified as having disabilities are best practices for all students. And so when we really support that tier of students, it lifts everyone up and it helps our collective performance for all of our students. And not even thinking just special education, it might be students who speak English as a second language, students who are currently displaced. So really helping that subset of students is going to lift our collective population.
Something like sort of like a daily or something like you said that can happen tomorrow for the classroom teacher. If you're a general education teacher and you are not, and I said this earlier, but are not familiar with your students' goals, please familiarize yourself with their goals. Get with the special education teacher at your school to see where they're at with their goal, and sort of work with them to make sure you all are on the same page when it comes to tracking those goals. They are in there for a reason. It is to make sure that our special education students are getting the best support that is needed. And so if that goal no longer aligns with them and they don't need that, then we need to know that. So make sure that you're familiarized with their goals, but also meeting with that special education teacher to track that as well.
That's awesome. All three of you. I love that there was like a mindset, curriculum, goals, right? You all hit on something a piece that's so critical. We also have just a series of resources that we pulled from the Department of Education that I think is always important. The Department of Education actually has a lot of really great resources that I think are at the disposal for parents. So we're going to drop those two resources in the chat. I will also share that if you have a question that didn't get answered tonight, or you want to follow up with one of these amazing panelists, please just send us an email at info@teachindynow.org, and we will make sure that we connect you. I want to turn things over because maybe this conversation has spurred you to think, I want to do more. I want to think about becoming a special education teacher. And Dr. Anderson, I want to turn things over to you to share a little bit about how somebody might go about doing that.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall. I appreciate that. So let me just, and I'm watching the time, so I'm going to be really quick about this. Let me just tell you that SpedX has a vertical that is called SpedRow, which stands for Special Education Rigorous Acceleration to Licensure. And that is an alternative pathway to special education licensure that has been approved by the state of Indiana. And if you are interested in becoming a special education teacher, either you want to transition to teach, this is a good program for you, or if you already have a license and are thinking about tagging on, you have a general education license and you're thinking about tagging on special education, also a good program for you. We are not that big. We only allow 10 teacher candidates in our program per year. And there's a reason for that. And that is because we walk alongside you every step of the way. You'll get a mentor, you'll get a coach. We also, it's a hybrid program. So we will see you in person as well as online. If you have any other questions, please visit spedx.org. You'll see a licensure tab there, and we can move forward. I wish some of you would talk with us.
Dr. Anderson, I will add spots are filling up quick. So if you're interested, I encourage you to visit quickly.
That's a great problem to
Yeah.
have. And you can be amazing like Alyssa, who in addition to her current role is in the program. And Alyssa, I just want a huge shout out to you. I mean, you clearly brought special education experience as though you've been a special education teacher for decades. So thank you again for sharing with us. I want to just say a quick thank you so much to all three of our panelists for sharing your expertise with us. I think we all left with something that we can really be thinking about, and a mindset shift, or hey, let me go back and check on somebody's goals and make sure that they're still up to date. And how do I make sure that this curriculum is aligned, right? So I just appreciate the three of you. I would be remiss if I didn't plug one last event that Teach Indy has coming up. On Saturday, April the 8th, we are going to be hosting a virtual hiring event. So that information here is going to be on your screen. It is free to register, and we will anticipate at least 20, maybe as much as 25 schools that are going to be joining. It's a great opportunity to secure that just right job for the future for the 23-24 school year. And so we hope that we will see you then. Again, thank you to everyone who's joined all 4 of these sessions. It's been a great year of talking about data, and we will be following up to let you know what we are thinking about for next year. But again, just thank you so much for your support of Teach Indy and our Teacher Talk series, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.